This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 41, Energy, the Missing Function of Economics.
Hello, I'm Phil Dobbie, and this is the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. Today is energy, the missing function of economics. Economists have traditionally spoken of the labour theory of value, including Marx, of course, who basically equated the cost of producing anything as a mix of the effort that's put in by the workers plus the cost of the capital, the machinery that's required to make the stuff. The capitalists skimmed the extra hours the workers did beyond their own needs and made a nice profit out of all of it. That was the theory. But in a number of podcasts, Steve has highlighted that there's a missing element in that basic theory. What's powering those machines? So, Steve, energy has to be part of the equation. So how did Marx and all the rest of them, how did they miss that one?
Well, it's actually very important. It is all the rest as well, because right from Adam Smith, actually, people see Adam Smith as the father of economics.
Yeah.
I can't think of a decent analogy. He's a decent man, so the idea about the guy who leaves the family and leaves them bereft is maybe a bit too harsh. But he's the guy who just misled us from the actual only group that got it initially right, which is the physiocrats across in France. And they did say that the only way production occurs is courtesy of the free gift of the sun. And that's, in terms of what we knew about energy and the sources of energy we had back in France in the 1700s, and even going back to the 1600s when this particular school of writing began, they were correct. That was the only correct statement ever had. And along comes Adam Smith, who actually went to France to tutor a young, wealthy scion over there, and also to learn as much as he could from the physiocrats. I don't actually know if he actually met Quenet, who was the leading physiocrat, but he certainly was influenced by them, read their material, and met some of the active members of the physiocratic group. But he came back and said, it's not energy. He didn't actually explicitly say it's not energy. He said it's the division of labour that gives rise to wealth. And so we start with a particular process where there's one person making a nail, and we divide it down into 15 different processes, and those 15 people make 15,000 nails in the time that one person would make 100 nails. That sort of argument. And then Marx, and then there was a whole question about where does profit come from? And in that situation, Smith really didn't have an answer. Ricardo had a half answer, but he couldn't explain why there was a difference between what was paid to the worker and what was paid to the capitalist. And Marx finally said, well, the difference comes out of the fact that any other commodity being used in production is just sold for it's sold as a commodity and used as a commodity. He said labour is purchased as what you pay for is called labour power, which is the capacity to work. What you get is labour, the actual performance of work. And he said that the gap at labour power is reproduced by giving a worker enough to stay alive, and that's it. Whereas labour can go on for longer. So it might take 6 hours to make the means of subsistence. It'll take 12. The worker gets to work a 12-hour day, courtesy of the labour contract, and that 6 hours additional labour is the source of profit for the capitalist, and the machinery plays no role. And I'll elaborate on that as we go along. But that was a starting position. And then the neoclassicals responded and said, well, it's actually not true to say that labour is the only source of value. It's the marginal product of labour and capital that determine the price at which things are produced. So they each labour and capital each contribute to production. In a competitive market, what the price falls to is the price for all labour sold and all capital sold is now equal to the marginal product of each of those inputs. Now, in the middle of all this total flurry of debates over whether labour is the only contributor to surplus and whether machinery adds anything at all, they completely forgot the role of energy. It just disappeared from the planet, which is a problem, because if it did disappear from the planet in reality, there wouldn't be a planet.
But was it because they were treating energy as part of that cost of capital? Were they saying, well, it's a cost like a machine? So a machine, for example, has components that last for a certain period of time. So is that any different, for example, to a tank of fuel, which only lasts for a certain period of time?
That was a sort of, I mentioned this in the background thinking that's going on. Anybody who's of my vintage may remember if their first year economics textbooks would describe that there were four means of production. There was land, labour, capital, and enterprise. That was, I still remember this crap from my first year university days, but there were these 4 factors: land, labour, capital, enterprise. Now, over time, the neoclassical theory has refined out of their discussion land and enterprise, leaving themselves just with labour and capital. So it's been a process. And then I have had one of my funniest interactions with a person with a PhD in economics. Actually came when I was giving a presentation on behalf of the CSIRO. Those who don't know, Australia, that's Australia's leading pure research institution. Has now been totally bastardised by turning into a competitive bloody institution over the last 10 to 15 years and almost destroyed. But back then it was into pure research. And I was asked to give a presentation for the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation to the United Nations Environment Programme in Bangkok about what was likely to happen to resource use in resource availability in Southeast Asia if current growth trends were continued. And as part of that, I was with another person who's a leading researcher in energy role in economics. And we were both talking about the essential role of energy. And this chief economist for the United Nations Environment Programme piped up and said, if we need more energy, we can just make it by combining labour and capital. And my colleague and I both looked at each other and then turned and said, so you believe in perpetual motion machines, do you? Mm. And he went, what? And I said, sorry, mate, you cannot make energy. That is the first law of thermodynamics. What is exists. So they've by the sequence of debating ploys between each of these different schools of economics over time, we've lost sight of the essential understanding that physiocrats had, and no other school of economics since has had, until the ecological school developed recently, that energy is absolutely crucial, and without it, nothing can be produced.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because before we had industry, we had agriculture, and the cycles of the economy then were almost certainly determined by the seasons, which were dependent on the activity of the sun. So it was very clear in those days, wasn't it?
Well, that's one of the reasons I think it was discovered by the physiocrats and lost by the English, because the physiocrats being based in France, when they were writing, France was overwhelmingly an agricultural nation. It was far more successful, a feudal state in that sense, than the English, where the king managed to lose his head on regular occasions. It wasn't until the final, off with his head guillotine stuff that was the end of the French feudal system. But in that system, the vast majority of people were caught up in agriculture in some way. And if you were a farmer, you knew that if you put one grain of corn, one grain of wheat in the soil and watered and tended it for a long enough time, then you'd harvest 10,000 off the plant that would grow off it. And where did it come from? It had to come from the land. And if you had any slightly deep rational capacity, you would say, well, what that land is doing is absorbing the energy coming from the sun, and therefore that's the essential role of energy. Now, when you go to you think about Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. The first steam engine, which is not the first steam engine by any means, but the first one with a governor, and that could therefore be used very reliably to power eventually pumping water out of coal mines, and then finally to power spinning jennies and the whole industrialisation of England. That I think was 1759. Of 1769, a short while before Smith wrote his book. And you'd already had a lot of industrialisation in England, running out of using wood, some use of coal, lots and lots of use of water mills. And that industrial, what you then had was the growth of specialised manufacturing. So in one sense, the source of value was more obscure to the more advanced country. It was more obvious to the less advanced, where agriculture was still the rule.
So this is an issue because it's a limited resource. Anything else, labour is limited obviously by the number of people. Capital has less limitations, but it's but you're saying it's it's a limit to growth. In which case, it's sort of nothing new, because of course the Club of Rome were banging on about this in the 1970s, that the economy can only grow so fast because there's only so many resources to go around. So whether we're talking about energy or resources, isn't it the same sort of issue?
No. Energy is very special, because the limits to growth is saying that if we and I've actually just written a post about that for patrons today, in a response to a question from Andre last week. The limits to growth are saying that not just the potential to run out of physical resources on the planet, but also the feedback effects of pollution, degradation, et cetera, and even if we didn't run out of resources, we could have feedbacks affecting the sustainability of life on the planet. That's different to saying whether you can produce output with or without energy. And in that sense, we could produce far more output if we could actually just harness the energy of the sun falling on the planet and use that for production. We could produce 100 times what we're producing right now. There's that much energy that is not being turned into industrial output. So the energy issue is separate and important, because if you get that one wrong, everything else is wrong as well. And that's one of the problems with modern economics, not just neoclassical, but even post-Keynesian and certainly Marxian. They get everything wrong by leaving out the most essential element of what it makes it possible to produce in the first place.
Right. Except for the fact they would be considering it, as I said earlier, wouldn't they just be saying it's a cost? Like a machine is a cost, energy is a cost. And, you said it yourself, there's a limitless supply of energy as long as the sun keeps shining. It's just the cost of tapping it, which is the significant factor.
No, it's more that if you're trying to explain what causes growth and where does growth come from, and what are the relationship between economic growth and the state of the ecology and so on, if you don't get the energy thing right first off, you'll stuff up all the way down the line. And that's because everything else, like if you can even produce people. Okay. Okay.
I've been involved in that process myself.
I know you have. Yeah, you haven't sold them yet, though. You're missing out on a nice profit there. But this is the thing: every other input can be produced. You cannot produce energy. Right. That is the huge difference. Okay, like land, even land, you can reclaim land if you like. There are resources which we literally know we can. If you need some more uranium or some more gold. You just collide a couple of, massive, use that particle accelerator, you can make it. But it's going to cost you energy. Right. And that is the thing, you cannot make energy. And then you also have the whole story about the degradation of energy over time, because we actually simply, we don't just destroy it when we use it, we change its form from high frequency to low frequency. And that's partly where global warming itself comes from. So there's a necessity for the entropy to strike as well. Now, all these things are something which flow out of giving energy the unique role it must have to understand production. You simply can't reduce it to something else.
Right, but energy is there. It's just a question of how you tap it. And, admittedly, the more you use, I can see that there's going to be diminishing returns. It's going to be more expensive to get hold of more energy once you've tapped the easy sources. But so long as the sun is shining, in theory, we've got a limitless supply of energy, haven't we?
We have, but even there's two extremes to this. One is that if you acknowledge the role of energy properly, you get a much better handle on what's actually caused economic growth, and what the impact that is ecologically as well. And that's the first point.
So you're saying the availability of energy has driven economic growth?
Yeah, and this is this has been obvious, of course, but working it out in terms of getting a mathematical equation that states this in a incontrovertible way, that's come about in a fairly tortuous process, because the neoclassicals, their preferred model of production is what's called the Cobb-Douglas production function, and that says output is a function of capital and labour, and they set it up in such a way that if you double the amount of capital or double the amount of labour, if you keep the proportion constant and double both, you double output. Constant returns to scale. So in that situation, they'll say output is some function of labour raised to some power, 0.7, multiplied by capital raised to 1 minus that power, like 0.3. And they then fit that to the data. Now, when they did that and they said, well, what actually causes change in output? Is it change in labour or change in capital? What are the relative contributions of the two? They found that only 15%, I think it was, of the change in output could be explained by change in capital or change in labour. 85% of it was unexplained. And this is known as the solo residual. It's been around for a long time. Now, the first attempts to build a production equation that included energy were done by Bob Ayres, who's a good friend these days, and a physicist who actually invented the term of externality many, many decades ago, but as a non-orthodox econophysics-oriented thinker with a PhD in physics. Bob and a colleague Kumel came up with what they call the Linux function, and that basically says, well, the production is a function of labour, capital, and energy, and the sum. When you're doing constant returns to scale, they had raised to the powers of alpha, beta, and 1 minus alpha minus beta, so the same constant returns to scale applies. That fitted the data much better. But I was always dissatisfied with that because it did imply that if you set the exponent for energy equal to 0, you could still have production. And I thought this is just nonsense. You can't have production without energy. So I was actually staying in Bob's place in France one day, and a little brainwave hit me out of the blue. And that was a little thought bubble that labour without energy is a corpse, and capital without energy is a sculpture. Right. And it may have helped. It may have helped that Bob's house is full of sculptures. I've got a feeling that's.
and a bottle of wine as well, no doubt.
A few of those.
Help with that thinking. Yeah, but I mean, but it's true. So you've got to have. You can't have zero energy. But I'm still confused as to why. So clearly, it's an important input.
No. But okay. Sorry.
You carry on then. Sorry, I'm just saying. Clearly, it's an input to any equation about what makes the economy tick. But there's lots of other factors, obviously, which are influential as well. I'm still struggling with why. Why it's not just considered as a cost, and accept the fact that there's a ceiling, and the cost will increase the more that you get close to that ceiling.
Well, it's not a cost. We are energy miners.
Yeah.
This is the thing. If we weren't mining energy, we wouldn't even exist. And this is why it's so crucial. If you don't get that right, everything else becomes useless, frankly. So, I just want to carry on for my little sculpture and corpse observation to say what the next couple of steps were to integrate it, and that's to say that labour and capital are effectively means of harvesting energy.
Right.
Okay. We are fundamentally living on the labour of energy slaves. Mm-hmm. We don't realise it, but that's how we actually get the level of standard of living we have these days. So you say, how do labour and capital harness energy? Well, simple. You harness energy by going out and having one of those bottles of wine and hopefully some protein and carbohydrate as well, bulking up to 4,000 calories for the day, and then hopping on your bike and riding wealthy people around around this town in which you live. A mechanical Uber style. So humans can take in about, say, 4,000 calories. They need, if they're working hard, at least, say, 2,000 of those to stay alive. The other 2,000 calories is useful work. Okay.
Yeah.
Now that's the ceiling. That's Arnie Schwarzenegger might be able to eat 6,000 and do 12. If you go back and watch the old, what was that original movie he made his claim to fame in? Conan the Barbarian.
Right.
Conan the Barbarian, with the one man turning the wheel took over the work of 12 turning a wheel. What you're really doing, what anybody who's exploiting labour or any other form of productive material is doing, is using it to exploit available energy and turn it into useful work. Now, so that's a very deep insight. So GDP, I redefine as useful work.
Right.
And labour being one of the sources, but the amount, how much useful work can a worker do per day? Probably the order of 2,000 calories a day. Then you say, what can a machine do? Well, then the argument the machine can take in much, much more energy. The first James Watt steam engine, I have no idea the amount of coal that it took in to actually power, but you'd imagine it might have been burning, say, 100 kilos of coal a day. That's its energy throughput. And then with that energy throughput, it could pump out water out of mines, it could turn spinning jennies, et cetera, et cetera. If you fast forward to now, what is the energy throughput of the most powerful machine on the planet? I saw a lovely interview with the Australian astronaut. I've forgotten his name now, but one of the few Australians has actually been up to the space shuttle and back. And he said on that flight, which I think lasted all of 8 minutes, he said the amount of fuel being consumed by the rocket to propel them up to the space station, I think was either 9 or 12 tons of fuel per second.
Yeah.
So we're gone from 100 kilos a day of coal to 10 tons of of high performance rocket fuel a second over the last 200 years. And fundamentally, that increase in the amount of energy that we harness, combined with the efficiency with how we do it, that's been the source of growth. So that unexplained factor in the neoclassical equation for output is fundamentally the contribution of energy.
So energy is one of the major contributors to wealth.
The only contributor
to wealth. Funny enough, I was going to say that and I felt uncomfortable saying it, but okay. So energy is the only contributor to wealth, and you've just said humans are not very efficient at using energy to create wealth. Machines are far better at it, perhaps explaining why we're seeing machines doing more and more.
Exactly, and it's also why we're so much wealthier than we were back then. Even if you've got enormous disparities in income and wealth, of course, across the planet. But if you look at the median human consumption of energy now versus consumption of energy 200 years ago, the increase in the amount of energy throughput we're actually able to experience is of the order of 10 and 20 times what was going around 3 centuries ago. So, and we don't even think about if you hop on the train to come up and visit me in London, you don't think about the amount of energy. You probably will next time you hop on the bloody train, but you don't think about the amount of energy you're consuming compared to what was necessary for somebody to make the same journey 200 years ago.
Yeah, no, actually, I normally think about how much it's costing, and is Steve Keen worth it?
Absolutely.
The thought as I buy that ticket. But does it mean then that if we just push to create more or tap more energy, we are going to create wealth because there's more energy available?
But then we have the feedback effects, which is the second stage, because there's only so much the energy that the ecosphere can absorb, beyond which it already takes from the sun and pumps out through radiating heat back into the atmosphere again. That's why we're dumping this waste heat into the planet. Now, this is completely independent of the whole issue about global warming. Right. If global warming were not even a factor, so if the planet had absolutely no global warming effect, in which case the average temperature of the surface, I think would be between minus 20 and minus 30 degrees Celsius, roughly a bad day in London, then that in that circumstance, our energy output on the planet in about 250 years would be sufficient to boil water.
Right. And we're seeing that in cities. So cities are several degrees warmer than they used to be because there's more people in them. There's more machines. We're creating, more air conditioning. Yeah. We're creating more heat, because we're using up more energy.
And then again, our source of wealth has actually been that increase in energy. And there's there's a wonderful lot when I'm taking some of the data about what would happen if we extrapolate current trends forward from a wonderful blog post from a blog called Do the Math by a physicist. And the post is called, I think, Finite Physicist Meets Exponential Economist. And this guy pointed out that if you take a look at the level of energy being consumed per capita in America, and there's data on this going back to about 1750 or thereabouts, and you extrapolate that forward and plot it against GDP, you find it's got almost perfect fit. And it's of the increase in GDP each year has been due to about a 2% increase in per capita energy consumption per year. And the only declines have been periods like the Great Depression and now, when because of our financial crisis, we stop improving our capacity to harness that free energy. So that's the relationship between energy and GDP. But the other side of it was, he said, if you extrapolate that use of energy and say, can we continue expanding our energy use at the rate of 2% per capita indefinitely? The answer is that if we keep on doing it and we do our production on the surface of the Earth, then I think it was 250 or either 250 or 450 years, the waste heat generated by that process without any global warming would mean the average temperature of the planet would go from minus 40 or minus 30 as it'd be without global warming to 100 degrees Celsius, enough to boil water. Another few hundred years after that, or even less, the surface temperature of the planet would exceed that of the sun. And if you kept on using this amount of energy, then in about 2,000 years, we'd be using more than the energy output of the galaxy. So in other words, we cannot sustain this indefinite increase in energy. But having said that, the amount of energy we can still exploit there if we rearrange where we produce our stuff off planet, frankly, we can still have a very, very comfortable future for the whole of humanity.
But it's not a direct linear relationship, though, is it? Because we use energy in different ways. So, for example, you gave the example, that we've got 2,000 calories of spare calories per day, perhaps, that we can use for work. Those 2,000 calories, when you were, I think you said you were, pushing a bike around town with a wealthy industrialist sitting or capitalist sitting in the seat behind, counting his money while you slogged hard. That's not a great use of energy. Whereas these days, we're using our brains, using less energy, but still creating wealth.
Well, I think it's actually the fundamental thing there is that taking that person in a bicycle is a damn sight easier than putting him on your shoulders and trying to walk with him sitting on you. So you get a multiplicative impact out of combining labour with capital. This is why the multiplicative form of the Cobb-Douglas production function makes sense, because the amount of, if you've got 2,000 calories to spare and you've got to carry a heavy bugger on your shoulders, you're not going to get so far before you collapse. If you take them on a bike, you can take them from, pretty much one side of London to the other.
Right, but a bit of sitting at a computer, writing stuff that is somehow creating wealth, that's using a lot less energy. This is why, again, I think it's important to get the role of energy correct in the first instance, because we normally get involved in these discussions about whether workers are exploiting capitalists or capitalists are exploiting workers, et cetera, et cetera. The truth is we're both exploiting free energy. Yeah. And if you're able to sit away and type up words, as I do, of course, for a living, and we do that, we're being supported by the energy slaves that we're getting a share of by our presence in a modern capitalist economy. And the pay rate gives us access to those energy slaves. So it is really, you're not producing, you're consuming, and so am I. The energy is being produced by people who are directly involved in mining that energy. And then when you look at what happens with various forms of production, in every case, what you can interpret what's going on in a particular field of production, like, for example, textiles, is turning energy into useful work to produce far more output than we could if we didn't use the same amount of energy. And that gives you a degree of homogenization between industrial sectors, which doesn't apply if you do the post-Keynesian thing, the Sraffian economic argument that that capital is very non-homogeneous. So you can't add a machine you can't add a computer to a drill, because they're such different things. But if you then say, well, they're both involved in harnessing energy to produce output in a particular sector, then there's, in fact, a homogenization out of that, which makes it more possible to do the adding up than it was otherwise. So, again, I think this insight about the role of energy helps transform a whole lot of economic theory. That's getting a bit esoteric for the discussion here, but the reality is still that we are really living. We think we're a capitalist nation. We're actually a slave nation, where the slaves are lumps of coal and oil. Right. Just one final point then. Presumably, we are also underpaying for it, because you made the point that there's a feedback loop here, so it's not limitless, which I've said a few times, that we can harness the sun, because you said we're going to fry ourselves alive. So there's a point at which and here it is a bit like pollution, isn't it? That we're polluting the planet and not necessarily paying for it. Similarly, we're consuming energy and not necessarily paying a reflective price, given that there is a constraint on it.
And that's one reason why I don't see things like carbon prices will solve the ecological crisis, because fundamentally, if you paid the full cost of energy, you'd lose money. Right. So the only way we actually make a profit is because energy comes to us free. And there's never going to be a way, and this is again where the second law of thermodynamics strike. There's a wonderful satirical statement of these laws by C.P. Snow, the physicist who was also a novelist in England back in the 1920s and 30s. And he said the laws of thermodynamics can be summarized in the following way. A, you can't win. Okay. B,
that's a good start.
Okay. B, you can't even break even. And C, you can't leave the game.
Right.
Now, that's paraphrasing. A, you can't neither create nor destroy energy. It's a fixed amount of it. B, the energy will degrade by use over time. That's the second law of the law of entropy. And the only way you can actually evade that is by finding somewhere in the universe in which you can dump all the waste heat generated, where the temperature is absolute zero, and there is no such place.
Right, which is why this is where you start talking spaceman talk and say we have to start dumping it elsewhere in the universe. All right, okay.
Indeed, that's right. If we dump it off the planet, we get about a 250 Celsius increase in the 270 Celsius increase in the amount of energy we can actually exploit. And last time I checked, there was no NIMBY movement floating between Mars and Venus.
Yet. All right, very good. Well, look, there's people heading over to Mars. Maybe we just need to give them a container vessel of our first container of waste. I'm not sure how you bottle heat. That's the only question, but I'm sure we'll find an answer to that one. Anyway, good to talk. I'm sure we will revisit this subject. Energy equals wealth. Nothing else. That's a simple equation. Even I can understand that one. Thanks, Steve.
Applied wealth. Welcome.
Well, it took a while, didn't it? But I think we got there in the end. Interesting stuff, isn't it? That is the Debunking Economics podcast. This one's for free. So if you're not normally a subscriber, you can hear lots more like this by subscribing at debunkingeconomics.com or become a supporter of Steve on Patreon. If you support more than $10 a month, then you get the podcast thrown in as part of that package. I'm Phil Dobbie. We'll catch you again soon, next time, with the Debunking Economics podcast.